Number 1. Robert R. Courtney, a Kansas City pharmacist who orchestrated one of the most heinous healthcare fraud schemes in American history, was born in 1952 in Kansas City, Missouri, into a family deeply rooted in the pharmaceutical business, a background that provided him with the knowledge and access he would later exploit to dilute life-saving chemotherapy drugs for profit, a crime that betrayed the trust of his patients and shocked the medical community. Courtney was a quiet, unassuming man who owned Research Medical Tower Pharmacy in Kansas City, and he was well respected in his community, but beneath this facade of professionalism lay a man driven by greed and a desperate need to pay off debts and maintain his lifestyle, a motive that led him to compromise the very essence of his profession. The victims of Robert Courtney were cancer patients, individuals fighting for their lives who trusted that the medication they were receiving would give them a fighting chance, but who were instead given diluted doses of chemotherapy drugs like Taxol and Gemzar, receiving as little as 1% to 15% of the prescribed dosage, a betrayal that robbed them of their time and their hope. One victim, Georgia L. Hayes, was a woman battling ovarian cancer who received diluted treatments and later died, her family unaware that her medication had been compromised, and another victim, B.C., was a man fighting leukemia who received watered-down drugs, and while Courtney was not charged with murder, the families of these patients believe his actions hastened their deaths. The setting for the crime was the Kansas City medical community, specifically the Research Medical Tower Pharmacy located near a major cancer treatment center, a location that gave Courtney direct access to the prescriptions of oncology patients. The timeline of events leading to the crime began in the early 1990s and continued for nearly a decade, during which Courtney systematically diluted the drugs he dispensed, pocketing the difference in cost and using the profits to pay off debts and fund his lifestyle. The discovery and initial investigation began in 2001 when a pharmaceutical sales representative noticed that Courtney was billing for significantly more drugs than he was purchasing from wholesalers, a discrepancy that raised red flags and led to an investigation by the FBI and the FDA. The forensic investigation involved the use of undercover agents who obtained samples of the drugs Courtney was dispensing, and laboratory analysis confirmed that the drugs were drastically diluted, with some samples containing only a fraction of the active ingredient. The breakthrough in the investigation came when investigators discovered a dilution log in Courtney's own handwriting, a notebook in which he meticulously recorded the amount of drug he was diluting, the date, and the patient's name, a damning piece of evidence that proved premeditation and intent. The arrest occurred on August 15, 2001, when Courtney was taken into custody and charged with 20 counts of tampering with consumer products and adulterating drugs, charges that carried a potential life sentence. The legal proceedings were a landmark case in healthcare fraud, and Courtney pleaded guilty in 2002 to 20 federal charges, including tampering with consumer products and adulterating drugs, as part of a plea bargain that spared him a trial but required him to cooperate with authorities and pay restitution. The sentencing hearing took place on December 5, 2002, where U.S. District Judge Autry Smith sentenced Courtney to 30 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the magnitude of his crimes and the harm he had caused to dozens of patients. Following his conviction, Courtney was transferred to a federal medical center, and as of the most recent reports, he remains in prison, and his case led to widespread reforms in the regulation of compounding pharmacies and increased oversight of drug distribution channels. The lasting impact of the Courtney case is profound, as it exposed the vulnerability of the drug supply chain and the potential for greed to compromise patient care, leading to calls for stricter regulations and better testing of compounded drugs, and serving as a cautionary tale for the pharmaceutical industry. Number 2. Barry J. Cadden, the co-founder and head pharmacist of the New England Compounding Center, NECC, was born in 1964 in Massachusetts, a man who built a massive pharmaceutical compounding business that would become the source of the deadliest fungal meningitis outbreak in U.S. history, a tragedy that killed 76 people and sickened hundreds more. Cadden was a licensed pharmacist who, along with his business partner, grew NECC into a massive operation that supplied injectable steroids to hospitals and clinics across the country, but behind the scenes, he prioritized profits over safety, ignoring red flags and cutting corners in the sterile processing of drugs, a decision that would have devastating consequences. The victims of Barry Cadden were patients who received contaminated steroid injections, primarily for back pain, including individuals like Edwin Ed Pratt, a 73-year-old man from Michigan who died after receiving a contaminated shot, and Lillian Lily Zuckerman, a 75-year-old woman who suffered a stroke and died after being injected with the tainted drug, and many others who suffered strokes, meningitis, and permanent disability. The setting for the crime was the NECC facility in Framingham, Massachusetts, a compounding pharmacy that operated under lax regulations and exploited loopholes in the law to mass-produce drugs without the oversight applied to large pharmaceutical manufacturers. The timeline of events leading to the crime began in the summer of 2012, when NECC shipped thousands of vials of methylprednisolone acetate, a steroid used to treat back pain, to medical facilities in 23 states, and as patients began to fall ill with fungal meningitis, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, launched a massive investigation. The discovery and initial investigation began in September 2012, when health officials noticed a cluster of unusual fungal meningitis cases and traced the outbreak to the steroid injections, leading to a recall of all NECC products and the shutting down of the facility. The forensic investigation involved the testing of the steroid vials, which were found to be contaminated with Xerohylum rostratum, a type of black mold, and a subsequent inspection of the NECC facility revealed horrifying conditions: visible mold and bacteria in the clean rooms, leaky ceilings, and a complete failure to follow sterile compounding procedures. The breakthrough in the investigation was the discovery that Cadden and other executives had knowingly shipped contaminated products and had a history of ignoring safety violations, including the use of expired ingredients and the reuse of sterilization vials. The arrest occurred on December 17, 2014, when Cadden was taken into custody and charged with 25 counts of second-degree murder, along with racketeering, mail fraud, and other charges. The legal proceedings began in 2017, with Cadden's trial in federal court in Boston, and the prosecution argued that Cadden was a pharmaceutical outlaw who ignored safety regulations to maximize profits, while the defense argued that he was a pharmacist who made mistakes but did not intend to kill anyone. On March 22, 2017, Cadden was found guilty of racketeering, mail fraud, and violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but was acquitted of the second-degree murder charges and was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Following his conviction, Cadden was transferred to a federal prison, and as of the most recent reports, he is serving his sentence, and his case led to the passage of the Drug Quality and Security Act, which increased FDA oversight of compounding pharmacies, a legacy of reform born from a preventable tragedy. Number 3. Glenn Adam Chin, the supervising pharmacist at the New England Compounding Center, NECC, was born in 1971 in Massachusetts, a man who worked under Barry Cadden and was directly responsible for the clean rooms where the contaminated steroids were manufactured, and who was also charged in connection with the fungal meningitis outbreak that killed 76 people. Chin was a licensed pharmacist who oversaw the sterile compounding operations at NECC, and he was the one who initialed the release forms for the batches of methylprednisolone acetate that were contaminated with black mold, a failure that led to the deaths of dozens of patients. The victims of Glenn Chin were the same as those of Barry Cadden, including patients like Eloise Ellie Bryan, a 77-year-old woman from Michigan who died after receiving a contaminated injection, and many others who suffered permanent injuries and death, and their families sought justice for the loss of their loved ones. The setting for the crime was the NECC facility in Framingham, Massachusetts, where Chin supervised the production of drugs in conditions that were anything but sterile, including dirty mats, leaky ceilings, and improper sterilization techniques. The timeline of events leading to the crime began in the months before the outbreak, when Chin and his team failed to properly sterilize the equipment and the drugs, using expired ingredients and ignoring the results of safety tests, a pattern of negligence that culminated in the shipment of contaminated steroids in the summer of 2012. The discovery and initial investigation was the same as the investigation into Cadden, and the FBI and FDA built a case that targeted both the owner and the pharmacist directly responsible for the clean room operations. The forensic investigation showed that Chin had initialed the release of drugs that had not been properly tested, and that he was aware of the contamination risks but failed to take action, a dereliction of duty that made him criminally liable for the deaths. The arrest occurred on September 4, 2014, when Chin was taken into custody and charged with 25 counts of second-degree murder, racketeering, and other charges. The legal proceedings began in 2018, with Chin's trial in federal court in Boston, and the prosecution argued that Chin was a central figure in the conspiracy to sell contaminated drugs, while the defense argued that he was a patsy for Cadden and that the contamination was an accident. On October 25, 2018, Chin was found guilty of racketeering and mail fraud, but was acquitted of the second-degree murder charges, and was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, a sentence that was slightly longer than Cadden's due to his direct role in the clean room operations. Following his conviction, Chin was transferred to a federal prison, and as of the most recent reports, he is serving his sentence, and his case reinforced the importance of personal accountability in the pharmaceutical industry, showing that pharmacists who ignore safety standards can face severe criminal penalties. Number 4. Eric Cropp, a pharmacist from Ohio, was born in 1967, a man whose criminal negligence led to the death of a 2-year-old girl, Emily Jerry, who was undergoing chemotherapy for a brain tumor, a tragedy that highlighted the critical importance of verification in pharmacy practice and led to changes in the law. Cropp was the supervising pharmacist at a compounding pharmacy in Ohio, and he was responsible for overseeing the preparation of chemotherapy drugs, but on a fateful day in 2006, he failed to check the work of a pharmacy technician who had prepared a bag of chemotherapy solution with a lethal concentration of sodium chloride, a mistake that went unnoticed and was then administered to Emily Jerry. The victim of Eric Cropp was Emily Jerry, a 2-year-old girl who had just finished her final chemotherapy treatment and was celebrating her victory over cancer when she received the fatal overdose, and she died 3 days later in excruciating pain, her death a senseless tragedy that devastated her family. The setting for the crime was a compounding pharmacy in Ohio, a place where chemotherapy drugs are prepared according to specific prescriptions, and where the supervising pharmacist is the final line of defense against errors. The timeline of events leading to the crime began on February 26, 2006, when a pharmacy technician prepared a bag of chemotherapy solution for Emily Jerry, using a base solution of sodium chloride that was 23% concentration instead of the normal 0.9%, a lethal error, and Cropp, as the supervising pharmacist, failed to catch the error and initialed the bag, allowing it to be dispensed. The discovery and initial investigation began immediately after Emily's death, when an autopsy revealed that she had died from hypernatremia, a condition caused by high levels of sodium in the blood, and a subsequent investigation by the Ohio State Board of Pharmacy found that the pharmacy had a history of errors and that Cropp had failed to follow proper verification procedures. The forensic investigation involved the analysis of the remaining chemotherapy bags, which were found to contain the lethal concentration of sodium chloride, and the testimony of the pharmacy technician, who stated that Cropp had been distracted and did not properly check the bag before releasing it. The breakthrough in the investigation was the realization that Cropp had initialed the bag without verifying its contents, a failure of his professional duty that directly caused Emily's death, and the case was referred for criminal prosecution. The legal proceedings began in 2009, with Cropp being charged with involuntary manslaughter and reckless homicide, and he pleaded no contest to the charges, avoiding a trial. On February 18, 2009, Cropp was sentenced to 6 months in prison, 6 months of house arrest, and 400 hours of community service, a sentence that was seen as lenient by Emily's family, but that marked the first time a pharmacist had been criminally prosecuted for a dispensing error that resulted in death. Following his conviction, Cropp lost his pharmacist license and has since worked to educate others about the importance of medication safety, and his case led to the passage of Emily's Law in Ohio, which allows for the criminal prosecution of pharmacists who make fatal errors due to negligence, and has served as a model for other states. Number 5. Kimberly Kim Hyatt, a nurse who also held a pharmacist's license, was born in 1971 in Washington state, and was involved in a tragic medication error that resulted in the death of an 8-month-old baby, a case that sparked a debate about the criminalization of medical errors and the mental health of healthcare professionals. Hyatt was working as a nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital in 2010, and she was also a licensed pharmacist, giving her advanced knowledge of medications, but she made a fatal error when she administered a massive overdose of calcium chloride to an infant, a mistake that led to the baby's death and ultimately to Hyatt's own suicide. The victim of Kimberly Hyatt was an 8-month-old baby named MK, who was recovering from heart surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital, and who was given a dose of calcium chloride that was 10 times the prescribed amount, causing cardiac arrest and death. The setting for the crime was Seattle Children's Hospital, a prestigious medical facility where Hyatt had worked for years as a nurse, and where she was trusted with the care of critically ill children. The timeline of events leading to the crime began on September 14, 2010, when Hyatt was preparing to administer calcium chloride to the infant, and she mistakenly took a vial of concentrated calcium chloride and administered it without diluting it, an error that she realized immediately but was unable to reverse. The discovery and initial investigation began immediately after the infant's death, with the hospital conducting a root cause analysis and the Washington State Department of Health launching an investigation, and Hyatt was placed on administrative leave and later fired by the hospital. The forensic investigation involved the analysis of the vials and the infusion pump, which confirmed that a massive overdose had been administered, and the investigation concluded that Hyatt had made a double-check error, failing to verify the concentration of the drug before administering it. The breakthrough in the investigation was Hyatt's own admission of the error, and the Washington State Nursing Commission charged her with unprofessional conduct, and she was also criminally investigated by the Seattle Police Department. The legal proceedings resulted in the Nursing Commission revoking Hyatt's license for at least 3 years, and the King County Prosecutor's Office decided not to file criminal charges, citing lack of criminal intent, but the stress and public scrutiny took a devastating toll on Hyatt. Following the incident, Hyatt suffered from severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, and on March 3, 2011, she took her own life, a tragic end to a case that highlighted the second victim phenomenon in healthcare and the need for a just culture that supports rather than punishes healthcare workers who make honest mistakes. The lasting impact of the Hyatt case is that it sparked a national conversation about the criminalization of medical errors and the mental health of nurses and pharmacists, and it led to calls for a more supportive and less punitive approach to handling medical errors, emphasizing the importance of systemic safeguards over individual blame. Thank you for watching to the end of this documentary. If you found this in-depth examination of pharmacists who violated their professional oath and caused harm informative, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. A like on this video helps tremendously with the algorithm and allows this content to reach more viewers. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Which of these cases had the greatest impact on you, and what are your thoughts on how the medical community can prevent such tragedies? I am also genuinely curious to know where in the world you are watching from right now, as this channel reaches a global audience and it is always fascinating to see the diverse locations of our community. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.